Hi everyone, thank you so much for being here. I'm Gayatri and I'm delighted that we're here today to celebrate the publication of Lisa Lowe's highly anticipated new book, The Intimacies of Four Continents. Over the past 2 decades, Lisa's meticulous, elegant scholarship on the global history of colonialism, on culture and globalization, on the gendering and racialization of capitalism and citizenship has radically transformed our understanding of the fields of post-colonial American and Asian American studies. In The Intimacies of Four Continents, Lisa undertakes what she terms a history of the present, one that provides a radically different genealogy of liberal modernity than that which we receive through dominant historiography. In order to illuminate the far-reaching implications of this work, we've brought together scholars working on disparate but yes, intimately connected fields of scholarship: Alyosha Goldstein, Moonho Jung, and Stephanie Smallwood. These are, I think, ideal interlocutors for Lisa's work, and I am very delighted that they could all be here today. The projects of each of these scholars, Alyosha's work on indigeneity and settler colonialism, Moon's work on Asian indentured labor, and Stephanie's work on the transatlantic slave trade, are central to Lisa's book, and together they signpost the vast conceptual, geographic, and temporal reach of her book. In addition to these 3 speakers, Lisa herself has generously offered to share some of her most recent work with us, we'll have Lisa present and hopefully respond to some of the interlocutors, and then we'll hopefully have a collective conversation. So to formally introduce each of these speakers, our first presenter is Moonho Jung, who is Associate Professor of History at the University of Washington. He's the author of Coolies and Cane, Race, Labor, and Sugar in the Age of Emancipation from Johns Hopkins in 2006, as well as numerous articles on race, empire, and Asian American history. His second book project, under contract with UC Press, is entitled The Unruly Pacific, Race, and the Politics, and I'm missing the rest of your subtitle.
What is it?
Race and the Politics of...
Revolution and Empire.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Our next speaker is Stephanie Smallwood. She is Associate Professor of History at the University of Washington. She's the author of the prize-winning monograph Saltwater Slavery, A Middle Passage from Africa to the American Diaspora from Harvard University Press in 2007. She's written extensively on slavery and the early modern Atlantic, and her latest book project is entitled Rethinking the Atlantic World, Historical Geographies of Power and Possibility, Empire and Revolution, something like that.
Yeah. That was the title like 3 years ago.
Okay. And finally, we have Alyosha Goldstein, Associate Professor of American Studies at the University of New Mexico. He's the author of Poverty in Common, The Politics of Community Action During the American Century from Duke in 2012, and the editor of the volume Formations of U.S. Colonialism, Duke to 2014, and he's also co-editor with Alex Lubin of a special issue of South Atlantic Quarterly on settler colonialism. His current manuscript in progress is entitled Colonial Accumulations, Racial Capitalism, and the Colonial Present. And finally, we have Lisa Lowe, Professor of English at Tufts University, prior to which she was Professor of Literature at UC San Diego. She's the author of 3 monographs, The Intimacies of Four Continents, just out from Duke, Immigrant Acts on Asian American Cultural Politics from Duke in 1996, and Critical Terrains, French and British Orientalisms from Cornell in 1991. She's also co-editor with David Lloyd of the volume The Politics of Culture in the Shadow of Capital, as well as co-editor with Jack Halberstam of the Perverse Modernities book series at Duke University Press. So let's start with Moon.
All right, thank you, Gayatri, for organizing this roundtable, and thank you all for coming. In his widely celebrated speech on race in March of 2008, which seems really, really long ago now, then presidential candidate Barack Obama seemed almost ready to reckon with the past. Toward the beginning of his speech, he said, I have brothers, sisters, nieces, nephews, uncles, and cousins of every race and every hue scattered across 3 continents. That's not bad. That was promising. Obama appeared poised to talk about the intimacies of 4 continents, or at least the intimacies of 3 continents. I think he was leaving out Europe in his configuration, but how can you leave out Europe, the mother lode of civilization? In any case, Obama wasn't going to talk about historical connections between the different continents. He wanted to talk about just one. And one nation within that particular continent. He said, and for as long as I live, I will never forget that in no other country on earth is my story even possible. And so it was that Obama would talk about slavery as the nation's original sin, only to proclaim that, as he put it, the answer to the slavery question was already embedded within our Constitution, a Constitution that had at its very core the ideal of equal citizenship under the law, a Constitution that promised its people liberty and justice, and a union that could be and should be perfected over time. In the end, Obama's multiracial and multi-continental family came to stand in for America's supposedly inclusive ethos and telos, as he called for a new beginning, a historical vision not bound to a tragic past, as he said, but striving for a more perfect union. I begin with Obama's race speech to point out the obvious. Barack Obama is no Lisa Lowe. Obama, and really everyone, needs to read The Intimacies of Our Continent right now, because it tackles some of the biggest and deepest questions of our past and of our present. By tracing a genealogy of modern liberalism through a careful and critical reading of the Colonial archive, Lisa Lowe's new book maps for us critical ways to reckon with the past and to imagine new kinds of historical questions and alternative futures. The Intimacies of 4 Continents is an expansive, ambitious project. There are so many layers to this book that it's hard to distill and summarize. But let me take a crack at it. And Lisa is here to tell me if I get anything wrong. Lisa's starting point and central argument is that slavery and empire created the condition of possibility for modern liberalism. That is, the emergence of the universal human with liberties and rights, Lisa argues, rested on the subordination and the exploitation of colonized and dispossessed peoples whose material labor and resources had made such liberties and rights conceivable in the first place, but whose own freedoms were precisely denied and exempted by that liberal philosophy. And it's an ongoing project and process, Lisa emphasizes. As she theorizes race, it is, in her words, quote, an enduring remainder of the processes through which the human is universalized and freed by liberal forms, while the peoples who created the conditions of possibility for that freedom are assimilated and forgotten, unquote. So how does that happen? In part, it's through the Colonial archive and liberalism as an intellectual and political project through academic disciplines, she argues, that disaggregates and elides the intimate connections between the 4 continents to reduce them to national histories and to frame them as seemingly discrete and disconnected developments. Now, these huge ideas unfold in the Intimacies of 4 Continents through critical readings of, among other things, colonial officials' memoranda, British parliamentary papers, Equiano's autobiography, the novel Vanity Fair, John Stuart Mill's writings, and C.L.R. James's Black Jacobins and W.E.B. Du Bois's Black Reconstruction, to explore critical shifts and historical connections across the 4 continents, specifically in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Reading these texts against the grain, she argues, Lisa argues, unsettles key precepts of modern liberalism, namely the political emancipation through citizenship in the state and the pursuit of economic freedom through free labor and free trade. In Lisa's hands, the story gets messy, really messy. Instead of a story of universal progress from slavery to freedom, Lisa exposes a series of tensions and contradictions that made liberalism's conceit so powerful, enduring, and blinding. She does so by drawing connections across time and space to connect the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade and slavery, for example, to British colonial interventions in Africa and Asia, and the British expansion of free trade around the world. In her chapter on colonial commodities, Lisa links the wider histories of production and consumption to bring to the fore the obscured role of colonized labor in China and South Asia in the formation of a world capitalist system. In doing so, she reveals a shift in British imperial discourse and policies toward free trade in the 19th century, a new form of what she calls imperial sovereignty that she argues did not mark a radical break from previous colonial practices. She argues, these are her words, the new form of imperial sovereignty expressed by 19th century free trade in India and China consisted in the power to adapt and improvise combinations of colonial slavery with new forms of migrant labor, monopoly with laissez-faire, and an older style colonial territory with new forms of security and governed mobility. And in her discussion of John Stuart Mill's writings, in particular as an officer of the East India Company, Lisa explains how despotism was not framed as the counterpoint to liberty, but as the very condition and foundation from which the concept of liberty emerged. Doing so, she argues, provides an optic on early 19th century liberalism and empire which might be otherwise unavailable. And it is that project to recast trade, all in all, to grasp the deep roots and the vast roots, that's R-O-U-T, of the formation of the Anglo-American-led world system that lives on very much in our own time. The Intimacies of 4 Continents argues that we have to study, as she puts it, as Lisa puts it, settler colonialism, slavery, indenture, imperial war, and trade together as braided parts of a world process that involved Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Americas. Doing so, she argues, provides an optic on early 19th century liberalism and empire which might be otherwise unavailable. And it is that project to recast the past, to get at a history of the moment, of the present, that animates and drives Lisa's new book. And she concludes the book by exploring the great intellectual and political stakes of studying the past. It's an exploration of historical method and historical practice that all historians must read. And I'm going to have all my students read it from now on, right alongside the last chapter of Black Reconstruction, Du Bois's Black Reconstruction that he titled The Propaganda of History. Now, Lisa begins her discussion with Hegelian and Marxist philosophies of history, which, despite their differences, both upheld teleological understandings of world history with freedom in Europe as its endpoint and the universalizing normative ideal. Lisa then reads C.L.R. James's Black Jacobins and Du Bois's Black Reconstruction to explore how they decentered Europe and engaged and interrogated Marx's subjects, categories, and methods. That was at the heart of the Black radical tradition that Cedric Robinson laid out in Black Marxism. Robinson put it this way: I have investigated the failed efforts to render the historical being of black peoples into a construct of historical materialism to signify our existence as merely an opposition to capitalist organization. We are that because we must be, but much more, as he said. And James and Du Bois, Lisa argues, contended with not only representing the centrality of enslaved labor and slave revolts to capitalist modernity, but also to critique Marx's and Hegel's philosophy of history. And in Du Bois's Black Reconstruction, we can begin to see a history not bounded by race or nation, but in terms capable, potentially capable of confronting liberal capitalism and modern empire. If not in the past, then at least in a future to come. As Du Bois stated famously, the emancipation of man is the emancipation of labor, and the emancipation of labor is the freeing of that basic majority of workers who are yellow, brown, and black. Now, on the very last page of our book, Lisa calls her approach a reading practice, her reading practice of past conditional temporality, a term to suggest, as she writes, that it is possible to conceive the past not as fixed or settled, not as inaugurating the temporality into which our present falls, but as a configuration of multiple contingent possibilities, all present yet not inevitable. She continues, a past conditional temporality suggests that there were other conditions of possibility that were vanquished by liberal political reason and its promise of freedom, and it suggests means to open those conditions to pursue what might have been, as she puts it. So in her excavation of the figure of the Chinese coolie that begins her books, Lisa writes, my interest in Chinese immigrant labor is not to pursue a single particularist cultural identity, not to fill in a gap of, or add on another transoceanic group, but to explain the politics of our lack of knowledge and to be more specific about what I would term the economy and affirmation and forgetting that characterizes liberal humanist understanding. And I think that's a really powerful call for how we should frame and pursue ethnic studies and Asian American studies. And in her last chapter, Lisa expands on that idea by stating that it is not her project to write a better history or to produce a more truthful or a fuller account. It's her project instead to explore how liberal narratives of progress and development have shaped understandings of the past and of the present. Developing her own philosophy of history, she writes, quote, only by defamiliarizing both the object of the past and the established methods for apprehending that object do we make possible alternative forms of knowing, thinking, and being. That's just beautiful, right? Historians tend not to think or write like that. And I can't think of a better way to phrase what history should be and could be. Every time I get lost in what I'm doing, I'm going to go back to that sentence. Let me conclude by making three somewhat related points or observations. Okay, number one, Lisa's book, in my estimation, is fundamentally about liberalism and empire. And I note that she defines very clearly and explicitly what she means by liberalism in several instances throughout the text, but I did not see an equivalent definition of empire. I'm not sure if she compiled her own index, but if you look up empire in the index, it says to see imperialism. Under imperialism, there's a long list of subcategories: capitalist, colonial difference in, as globalization, intimacies of, liberalism and, modes of governance, sovereignty. Now, the intimacies of four continents is principally about the British Empire, but I think her use of the term empire suggests something else worth highlighting. Lisa approaches empire fundamentally as a process, harkening back to the original definition of empire in the English language, that is, that which is subject to imperial rule. It's her project to study the many historical and cultural processes through which different peoples across the continent and have become subject to imperial rule. My second point, as Lisa notes in her book, I've argued in my own work that the racial charge of coolies, that is, that Chinese workers in the United States were enslaved workers, constituted a pivotal justification to exclude Asian workers from the United States. What I did not recognize enough, though, was the degree to which Chinese exclusion had to do with empire. When the US Supreme Court weighed in on Chinese exclusion, it did not dwell on the question of slavery and freedom, although it was very much implied. It turned instead to national security, the legal grounds around which the US state claimed authority over immigration and deportation. In 1889, the Supreme Court ruled, quote, to preserve its independence and give security against foreign aggression and encroachment is the highest duty of every nation, whether from the foreign nation acting in its national character or from vast hordes of its people crowding in upon us. The government, possessing the powers which are to be exercised for protection and security, is clothed with authority to determine the occasion on which the power shall be called forth, and its determination so far as the subjects affected are concerned are necessarily conclusive upon all its departments and officers. If the US state categorized foreigners of a different race as dangerous to its peace and security, the court reasoned its designation and exclusion could not be stayed because at the time there are no actual hostilities with the nation of which the foreigners are subjects. As Lisa argues in her book, the liberty of some rested on securing their liberty from others. The making of liberal political subjects, a political community in and through the state, rested on the simultaneous making of racialized subjects of empire. Third, my last point, by World War I, when Indian nationalists pressed the British state to abolish indentured migration, or the trade in so-called coolie trade in people, because it was deemed a relic of colonialism and slavery of yesteryear, British and US states openly embraced and proclaimed democracy as a war objective. Abolishing coolie labor now seemingly necessitated an imperial war. Now, in that context, in stepped W.E.B. Du Bois. In 1915, Du Bois published The African Roots of War, perhaps one of his most insightful pieces that did what history should do. Race and empire, Du Bois argued, sowed the seeds of war. He said, the Balkans are convenient for occasions, but the ownership of materials and men in the darker world is the real prize that is settling the nations of Europe at each other's throats today. For Du Bois, the formation of the modern nation, which he said was a new democratic nation composed of united capital and labor, explained the new stage of, as he put it, worldwide freebooting, where the white working man has been asked to share the spoil of exploiting chinks and niggers, as he said. What emerged was a democratic despotism rooted in the color line, demarcated and enforced by immigration restrictions, segregation codes, and brutal violence. Du Bois stated, all over the world there leaps to articulate speech and ready action that singular assumption that if white men do not coddle colored men, then China, India, and Africa will do to Europe what Europe has done and seeks to do to them. The extension of the democratic ideal to the yellow, brown, and black peoples may bring about real peace and lasting culture, Du Bois proposed. Otherwise, he warned, these nations and races, composing as they do a vast majority of humanity, are going to endure this treatment just as long as they must, and not a moment longer. Using Lisa's words, Du Bois was very much involved in, quote, the project of imagining, mourning, and reckoning other humanities within the received genealogy of the human. And so were a bunch of revolutionary South Asians in San Francisco who stated in 1917, and I'll end with this quote, it's a quote that I came across a couple weeks ago. They're writing in the middle of World War I. When the British declare that they are fighting for democracy, even unborn children laugh at the humor of it. The dead rise from their graves and mock at them and say, "Why so many lies, O Englishmen?" O tyrannical Englishmen who are fighting for democracy, who have trodden underfoot the peoples of the world, who have broken promising buds or have at least killed them by the darkness of tyranny. Their message, of course, was deemed seditious against the liberty and security of Great Britain and the United States. In a nutshell, that was liberalism and empire at work. Thank you.
I'm going to bring both of my devices because I only just got the iPad that I want to use to connect to the internet, but I'm a little nervous about whether it's going to remain happy. So one way or the other, I'll be okay. First off, I just want to say how delighted I am to be a part of this panel with good friends. Lisa and I have been interlocutors and friends around some of these questions for quite some time now, going back to our days together at UC San Diego. And so it really is a tremendous honor to sort of participate in this, I think, celebration of what is a really, really brilliant book. All right, let me get right to this because I'm going to go over time if I don't. The Intimacies of Four Continents is an extraordinary and groundbreaking book. And I know groundbreaking is a phrase that we maybe too casually toss around, but I am very serious and deliberate when I use that phrase. I think it's appropriate because this book really has no analog that I can think of, and I'm glad to be following Moon's brilliant kind of summary, which is kind of impossible because it's such an expansive book. But I think Moon's brilliant presentation of some of the themes in the book really captures that. It really does put things together in ways that I don't think anyone else has done before. It really does ask questions. It crystallizes questions in ways that I think have not been done with this kind of dexterity and grace and brilliance before. And so in all sorts of ways, I have and continue to learn a great deal from what Lisa has achieved here. And as Moon just pointed out, you know, Lisa says it wasn't her aim to write a better history, but as far as I'm concerned, and I'm a historian, so I can sort of say this, I think that's exactly what she has done, and I'm serious about that. I regard Intimacies as an absolutely vital work of historical knowledge production. But having said that, I think it's really important to note that I don't think a disciplinarily trained historian could have conceived this book. Maybe you could. Whether implicit or explicit, disciplinary history's organizing category is the nation or some otherwise bounded socio-territorial entity. The discipline is arguably incapable of thinking outside of those boxes with any kind of dexterity or finesse. And that is exactly what Lisa does here. The Intimacies of Four Continents takes as its object the phenomenon of racial empire and excavates the work that liberalism did to make and buttress empire. I have more general thoughts about the book's broad framing and the argument that is embedded and manifested in her framing, in her notion of intimacies, but I'm going to save those for the discussion part of the session because otherwise I'll run out of time. What I'm going to share now is a reflection on the second chapter of the book because it's the one that engages most directly with my own areas of knowledge, and more importantly for me, it speaks to the work that I'm doing now, which is a book that's currently entitled Africa and the Atlantic World, A Geopolitical History. And my plan for this project includes a chapter on the relationship between abolitionism and colonization schemes that purported to send Africans and African Americans back to Africa, and will include an analysis of Equiano's narrative. So disclosure here, my deep interest in and engagement with this particular chapter is entirely selfish. The second chapter of Lisa's The Intimacies of Four Continents is entitled Autobiography Out of Empire, and it offers a wonderfully nuanced reading of Olaudah Equiano's autobiography, the interesting narrative of the life of Olaudah Equiano, or Gustavus Vasa, the African, written by himself, published in 1789. Equiano's narrative is, as we all well know, a text that uses the autobiographical form to narrate his experience of a life gone from transatlantic slave ship captivity and maritime slavery to freedom through self-purchase and ultimate rise to stature as an anti-slavery activist in late 18th century England. An extraordinary tale whose construction, and I use that word very deliberately, traces a progression out of the darkness of slavery into the light of freedom. It is no wonder that of the handful of African-authored anti-slavery texts produced in the era of the slave trade abolition campaign, Equiano's was the one that garnered the largest audience and notoriety. If ever there was a true tale that expressed the tenets of the liberalism that was finding its fullest ever articulation in late 18th century Anglo-American political philosophy, it was Equiano's. His story seemed to make manifest the promises of liberalism. Under the auspices of free contract wage labor, of free trade, of rights discourse, slavery will become freedom. The darkness of primitivism will give way to the light of civilization. The inexorable march of progress will carry us forward. But as Lisa shows, Equiano's story is best understood instead as an expression of the false promises of that liberalism. She does so by nuanced readings of the text itself that illuminate its paradoxes, its contradictions, and its instabilities, all of which reveal that no matter how hard he tried, no matter how well it seemed at times to fit the formula perfectly, Equiano could never fully adapt his life story to the genre of the autobiography. But before she even gets to those close readings of the text, she exposes its troubled relationship to the tenets of liberalism, first by the way she insists on situating Equiano's text. She rightly insists that in the work of historical knowledge production, it matters, and I'm quoting her now, which archives, events, temporalities, and geographies will be privileged in the situating of Equiano's story. Lowe's incredibly important maneuver, as historian, is to situate Equiano's narrative adjacent to British Colonial Office papers discussing the transport of Chinese workers to the British Caribbean. In so doing, she begins the chapter by foregrounding a fact that is rarely, if ever, acknowledged and given interpretive meaning in the historical literature. That even before the ink was put down on paper, much less dry, on the 1807 Slave Trade Abolition Act, the first shipment of indentured Chinese were being smuggled to Trinidad. They were aboard an East India Company ship whose Bengal to Trinidad voyage was carried out in secret under the auspices of what colonial officials dubbed the Trinidad experiment. Indeed, the voyage was documented in the Colonial Office papers only because its irregularity sparked suspicion and prompted an investigation. And lest we have any doubt about the degree to which the logics of liberalism infused this scheme to bring indentured Chinese to the plantation landscape of the British Caribbean, we have the words of the British Solicitor General as he attempted to persuade investigators that the vessel and its cargo were sanctioned. Assuring investigators that the voyage had been authorized by the Secretary of State, the Solicitor General explained that by this Trinidad experiment, the British Crown envisioned that indentured Chinese, and I'm quoting him now, will eventually supersede the continuance of the slave trade in the West Indies. Eventually, supersede. continuance. This language could not be more indicative of the logics of liberalism. The logic by which it could first be agreed that the slave trade was a problem in need of a solution, and secondly, by which a solution could be devised, included the promise of an alternative source of supply of cheap and exploitable labor for the plantation economies, unbroken continuity in the supply of that labor, and a carefully managed, smooth transition between the two systems, from the bad, old slave trade to the new and improved free system of acquiring, transporting, and distributing indentured Chinese. By prefacing her analysis of Equiano's narrative with discussion of the secret Trinidad experiment, Lowe illuminates the intimacy between Africa and China, between slavery and indenture. Moreover, by taking us into the colonial archive and not just disclosing the secret Trinidad experiment, but giving it interpretive meaning, Lowe has carefully positioned us to be critical interpreters of Equiano's narrative. Because now we know what Equiano and sympathetic contemporary readers of his narrative did not know, could not know, because they were not privy to the colonial archive and its secreted memorandums and schemes. Equiano and the reading public were not supposed to appreciate just how much the discourses of abolition and emancipation celebrated by liberal reform agendas were part and parcel of pragmatic, problem-solving solutions meant not to eliminate, but rather to adapt old labor systems to new circumstances and opportunities. After all, the era's liberal reforms never proposed to eliminate the plantation. They devised means rather to adapt, indeed to extend, the plantation to new forms of coerced labor and new sites of territorial expropriation and extraction. And so with the framing Lowe provides, we are primed to approach Equiano's narrative with a degree of skepticism about the liberal discourses in which it participates. Lowe's analysis centers specifically on the form and genre of the autobiography in order to show how the autobiographical form is the cultural corollary or expression of liberalism's political and economic tenets. Deployed to narrate the life of a figure such as Equiano, then, the autobiography must fulfill the, quote, liberal imperative to implot the transition from slavery to freedom. As Lowe demonstrates, Equiano's attempt to fit his life story to the form of the autobiography, to, as Lowe puts it, translate colonial slavery into the conventions of the liberal autobiographical genre, necessarily falters. It is marked, Lowe observes, again and again by the limits to his attainment of freedom. Drawing threads from the work of other critical readings of the narrative, Lisa quite movingly, I think, draws our attention to the subtle notes that distinguish Equiano's rendering of the liberal autobiographical form and reflect the ways the violences of colonial slavery gave it particular shape, its multivocality and its temporal instabilities, for instance. Equiano's narrative expresses the ways colonial slavery bent and distorted the autobiographical form. The narrative's particular complexities and contradictions reveal that what Lowe calls the residues of slavery remain after the attempt to fit a life shaped by colonial slavery into the autobiographical form. As Lowe demonstrates by her analysis of the narrative's second half, Equiano's life in freedom, foregrounds the tensions and contradictions of liberal emancipation. And I would go further and say that as it is represented in the narrative, Equiano's life and freedom foregrounds duplicity of liberal emancipation. Even as he comes up against the racial logic that always imposes structural limits on the freedom he has attained, we see the emancipated Equiano of the narrative assuming, however awkwardly and failingly, what Lowe aptly characterizes as an imperial subjectivity. For the penultimate promise liberalism offers to the free man is not just possession of oneself as a political economic subject, but also a relation to others expressed in the imperial idioms of ownership, domination, and disciplinary control. That is the subjectivity Equiano's former master, Robert King, charges him to take up in Freedom when he instructs Equiano to anticipate a future in which he will, quote, have land and slaves of his own. It is the subjectivity that leads Equiano to imagine himself in the image of Christopher Columbus when trying to proselytize to indigenous peoples on the Mosquito Coast of Honduras and Nicaragua. Here we find him, as Lisa puts it, emulating the colonizer, writing of the rage he felt toward one of the unruly Indians. He writes, "I could have wished to have seen him tied fast to a tree and flogged for his behavior, recollecting a passage I had read in the life of Columbus." It is the subjectivity, an imperial subjectivity, that Equiano is expected to adopt in relation to the indigenous African communities colonized by the Sierra Leone settlement he helped establish in West Africa. But nowhere is the freed Equiano more fully the imperial subject than in the pages that bring the narrative of his personal triumph over slavery to closure. Here, Equiano's own story comes to an end at the moment that Parliament has begun to consider anti-slave trade legislation. Now the narrative has caught up to the present, and there is no more narrating for Equiano to do. Now we find Equiano expressing his hopes for the future. He writes, "I hope to have the satisfaction of seeing the renovation of liberty and justice, resting on the British government to vindicate the honor of our common nature." Here Lowe astutely observes that the work the autobiographical form in fact was meant to do was to represent not just the self-authorizing individual, but also the larger collective of which he was a part. Liberalism, he writes, requires mediation through an aesthetic form that encourages readers to understand the emancipation of an individual as if it were a collective emancipation. If Equiano's narrative was meant to map or model the emancipation of all Africans, his countrymen, as he referred to Africans throughout the text, then arguably it is at this moment of attempting to bring the narrative to satisfying closure that the autobiographical project fails most miserably. If the freedom that liberalism promised to Equiano was to purchase himself and thus achieve a kind of mastery, as Lisa puts it, of the political economy of slavery, what were the freedoms that liberalism promised to Equiano's African countrymen? As Lowe explains, what Equiano envisions and recommends is that, I'm quoting her now, the best solution to the abolition of slavery is the expansion of trade between Britain and Africa. Equiano writes, "As the inhuman traffic of slavery is now taken into consideration of the British legislature, I doubt not if a system of commerce was established in Africa, the demand for manufactures would most rapidly augment, as the native inhabitants would insensibly adopt the British fashions, manners, customs, etc. I proportion to the civilization, so will be the consumption of British manufactures." He continues, "The wear and tear of a continent, nearly twice as large as Europe, and rich in vegetable and mineral productions, is much easier conceived than calculated." He elaborates, "It is trading upon safe grounds. A commercial intercourse with Africa opens an inexhaustible source of wealth to the manufacturing interests of Great Britain, into all which the slave trade is an objection. The manufacturers of this country must and will, in the nature and reason of things, have a full and constant employ by supplying the African markets." That inexhaustible source of wealth, it's basically completely parallel to the language of political economist Malachi Postlethwaite in the same era. He continues, population, the bowels and surface of Africa, abound in valuable and useful returns. The hidden treasures of centuries will be brought to light and into circulation. Industry, enterprise, and mining will have their full scope, proportionably as they civilize. In a word, it lays open an endless field of commerce to the British manufacturers and merchant adventurers. The manufacturing interest and the general interests are synonymous. The abolition of slavery would be in reality a universal good. And finally, Equiano comes to his ultimate gesture on behalf of Africans. He writes, "This I conceive to be a theory founded upon facts, and therefore an infallible one. If the blacks were permitted to remain in their own country, they would double themselves every 15 years. In proportion to such increase will be the demand for manufactures. Cotton and indigo grow spontaneously in most parts of Africa. A consideration this of no small consequence to the manufacturing towns of Great Britain. It opens a most immense, glorious, and happy prospect, the clothing, etc., of a continent 10,000 miles in circumference and immensely rich in productions of every domination in return for manufactures." With these entreaties, Equiano has already laid out in his autobiography, published in 1789, what Britain's Lord Palmerston would declare as a statesman in 1842. Palmerston writes, "Let no man imagine that those treaties for the suppression of the slave trade are valuable only as being calculated to promote the great interests of humanity, and as tending to rid mankind of a foul and detestable crime. Such was indeed their great object and their chief merit, but in this case, as in many others, virtue carries its own reward. And if the nations of the world could extirpate this abominable traffic, and if the vast population of Africa could by that means be left free to betake themselves to peaceful and innocent trade, the greatest commercial benefit would accrue, not to England only, but to every civilized nation which engages in maritime commerce. These slave trade treaties, therefore, are indirectly treaties for the encouragement of commerce." So, having narrated his own purported triumph over slavery, the best Equiano can do to imagine freedom for the collectivity of Africans is to ask permission for them to remain in Africa, where he promises they will conform themselves into happy consumers of British manufacturers and producers of raw material to fuel Europe's phalanx of industrial machinery. Here I think it's important to note something that the liberal genre of the autobiography requires Equiano to somewhat elide, and that is the conditionality of his own emancipation. Nothing of the discourse of liberalism in the late 18th century compelled Robert King to emancipate Equiano. Least of all, Equiano's successful accumulation of capital equal to his price as human property. His emancipation was a gift, entirely contingent on King's benevolence, as were all emancipations of enslaved persons. Indeed, the English term manumission derives from the Latin manutere, literally to let out of hand. This fact is, of course, revealed in the narrative. I'm not suggesting that Equiano erases or hides it in any way. But I would argue, in thinking along with Lisa about the demands of the autobiographical form and the work it was meant to do, that the genre requires Equiano's particular framing of his emancipation, with its emphasis on his acquisition of property, its implantment of himself as the agent making the emancipation happen. But in fact, his emancipation was only ever, we might argue, the performance or the staging of the free individual's mastery of economy that liberalism celebrated. After his performance of mastery was over, his freedom came only because King exercised his entirely arbitrary power to either accept or deny Equiano's request, to make good on his promise or not in Equiano's favor. If the limits of the autobiographical form meant that Equiano could only pretend to be the agent of his own emancipation, what did its limits mean for his ability to represent and imagine freedom for Africa? Here again, I would argue, is where the genre entirely fails Equiano. In this sense, the narrative reflects the costs and the perils of seeking freedom through liberalism's promises. It's not just that the freedoms liberalism promised to Equiano were not always fulfilled or made manifest for him personally. It's that they also produced his complicity in what was always necessarily also a false set of promises to the larger collective of African peoples across the continent. Okay, I'm running out of time, so I'm going to skip forward just a little bit. Ultimately, Equiano got his wish. British Parliament did abolish the nation's slave trade by the 1807 Slave Trade Abolition Act, and then abolished slavery throughout the British Empire in 1838. But we might say that he should have been more careful about what he wished for. Arguably, there are indeed hundreds of thousands of West and West Central Africans who otherwise would have been captured and shipped to the Americas aboard slave ships, who instead got to stay in Africa, where many of them now produce the items demanded in a new system of quote-unquote legitimate trade, as British liberals termed it. Many of these Africans also produced the new legitimate goods under conditions of enslavement as various forms of bondage grew and expanded within Africa. To conclude, then, I want to bring us back to the intimacies that Lowe shows to be so important to our understanding of empire. If we confine our story to the archive of the Atlantic slave trade, we miss a vital corollary to the story told by Equiano's autobiography. Namely, that as the last known slave ship carrying enslaved Africans arrived in Cuba in 1867, its human cargo was not, in fact, alone in transatlantic waters. By now, the secret Trinidad experiment had manifested into a new full-blown system for acquiring and globally dispersing cheap, exploitable plantation labor. The traffic in so-called coolies of varying East and South Asian origin was in full swing. The Intimacies of Four Continents then brings clearly into view something we've struggled fully to apprehend, which is the deeply entwined relationship between liberalism, with its promotion of free wage labor, rights, and free trade, and the ongoing elaborations of racial colonialism and empire in the so-called Age of Emancipation. Lisa's historically informed analyses of the literary and cultural forms of Anglo-American liberalism help us to see just how much the promises of emancipation ultimately were a big fat ruse. This was not the progressive transition from slavery to freedom that much of the economic and history scholarship portrays. It was rather the innovation of new and varied categories of coercion and discipline by which Britain managed labor both abroad and at home. Thus did the modern global imperial form take shape out of the bedrock of mercantilist colonialism, and thus did the proliferation of freedom produce domination everywhere. Thank you.
It's really an honor to be in conversation with the extraordinary scholars on this panel, and to be gathered here on the occasion of engaging the intimacies of four continents. So my paper is going to take a slightly different turn, and hopefully it will still be quite evident that it's engaging the text, but I'm not actually reading through the specific text itself. So my remarks this afternoon take inspiration from the intellectual generosity of Lisa Lowe's work and the conception of the intimacies of four continents as a heuristic and a method through which to observe, in her evocative phrasing, the, quote, constellation of asymmetrical and unevenly legible intimacies, end quote, that have been the conditions of possibility for liberal modernity, even as liberal modernity has been premised on the disavowal of these constitutive entanglements. So my intention is to think with the intimacies of four continents, and to do this specifically by looking at the ways in which Puerto Rico negotiates what Lowe calls the colonial division of intimacy, the U.S. Supreme Court having infamously rendered Puerto Rico in 1901 as foreign to the United States in the domestic sense. The specific liberal configuration of this colonial relation became further pronounced when Luis Muñoz Marin, the island's first elected governor, and the Popular Democratic Party succeeded in remaking the political status of Puerto Rico as a so-called free associated state or commonwealth in 1952 as a way to maneuver between the foreign and domestic of U.S. colonial rule. That the efficacy of this free association was predicated on the Muñoz administration's brutal suppression of the 1950 Nationalist Party uprising, relentless counterinsurgency against independence activists, and the exigencies of the Cold War grand strategy underscores Lowe's consideration of liberalism from the perspective of Mill's argument, quote, for the necessary use of force in governing liberty. With Lowe's remarkable text in mind, I'm interested in how Puerto Rico's ambiguous free associated political status and the surrogate discourse of the so-called status question more broadly conveys the dynamics of differential racializations and liberal colonial governmentality between the mid-20th century and the present conjuncture. I suggest that the circumstances of Puerto Rico in this sense can be usefully considered in terms of Lowe's provocation, quote, to reflect on what it means to supplement forgetting with new narratives of affirmation and presence, struggling to comprehend the particular absence of the intimacies of four continents, to engage slavery, genocide, indenture, and liberalism as a conjunction, as an actively acknowledged loss within the present, end quote. In what follows, I'll say a few words about the Munoz administration's conception of free association as articulated with the racial ideology of Spanish, African, and indigenous ancestries as the collective inheritance of Puerto Rican cultural nationalism. And I'll speak about the 1998 and 2012 referendums on the status question as each differently performing the protracted colonial relation as in a certain respects unrepresentable, as both further instantiating and interrupting what Lowe calls, quote, the economy of affirmation and forgetting that structures and formalizes liberal ways of knowing, end quote. And link this unrepresentability to Puerto Rican histories of anti-Black disavowal and predicaments of indigeneity. During the mid-20th century then, the Munoz administration promoted a version of racial liberalism and cultural nationalism intended to divert anti-colonial sentiments away from demands for political sovereignty and decolonization, valorizing an autonomous Puerto Rican culture while aligning the island with U.S. political and economic interests. Similar in certain respects to Jose Vasconcelos' conception of La Raza Cósmica in Mexico and Gilberto Freire's myth of racial democracy in Brazil, Munoz emphasized the metaphor of a racially harmonious so-called Great Puerto Rican Family as a means to unify the island across racial and class differences in support of a program for modernization, development, and liberal democracy. This Great Puerto Rican Family entailed disavowing the salient afterlives of slavery and extent of anti-Black racism in Puerto Rico, and an insistence on the extinction of indigeneity as embodied by distinct living peoples. Although strategically associated with the U.S., the Popular Democratic Party projected anti-Black racism as something imposed or exported from the U.S. and championed instead an idealized racial mixture as a democratizing force, in contrast to U.S. policies of racial segregation and anti-miscegenation laws. Drawing on traditions of Puerto Rican Hispanism, elites distinguished themselves from U.S. white supremacist ideology by contrasting U.S. histories of chattel slavery and racial exclusion to the supposedly more tolerant, or at least nuanced, regimes of slavery and race under the Spanish colonial caste system. Yet, as Arlene Davila contends, and this, quote, racial syncretism amounted to an inclusive ideology of exclusion that hides the unequal valorization of its racial components under the trope of racial mixture, end quote. This is evident, for instance, in the decided whitening and the whitened representations of the Jibaro, the Puerto Rican rural peasant, as marked as being sort of principally of Spanish descent, as the symbol of the Popular Democratic Party and at the time the nation itself. These multiple and historically shifting dynamics of racialization and colonial difference as attached to discrepant terms of belonging and identification are, I would argue, constitutive of the so-called status question. As has been widely discussed, analyzed, and lamented, the status question, as defined in terms of institutionalized options for statehood, independence, and free associated state, aligned with specific party affiliations, has come to predominate conventional political discourse on and about the island. The status question has often been described by critics as an impasse or stalemate, a circumscription of political imagination that perpetuates politics as usual on the island and for the diaspora. Intermittent island-wide plebiscites on the status question and annual presentations before the United Nations Decolonization Committee can further convey these recursive dynamics. Rather than simply or only an impasse, however, I want to suggest that the status question actually calls attention to the ongoing conditions and practices of U.S. colonialism. As a response to the apparent inescapability of U.S. colonialism, the status question functions as a representation or a surrogate discourse that provides conventional terms for speaking about things other than only what is literally said. And in this sense, Judith Butler's theorization of unrepresentability by way of Levinas is useful in thinking about a representation as providing a similar understanding of these dynamics. So Butler emphasizes representation as performing a manner of affirmation in that, quote, very disjunction that makes representation impossible, end quote, such that this disjunction is conveyed in the impossibility of representation itself. Which is to say, representation in this sense must not only fail, but it must show its failure. It is by underscoring this gap, this failure, that representation has the capacity to disrupt the normative closure and highlight the mechanisms of identification such normativity aims to secure. Thus, as Butler further argues, quote, identification always relies upon a difference that it seeks to overcome. And this aim is accomplished only in reintroducing the difference it claims to have vanquished, end quote. This is not the same, I don't think, as the crisis as rupture, which is the case of, in the case of Puerto Rico, which is sort of at once normalized as ongoing conditions of austerity and unlivability, as in the past decade of economic recession on the island, or as a spectacularized event, as in the Puerto Rican debt crisis and loan default that momentarily drew global news coverage this past summer. But these conditions do place the status question and its grammar of belonging under increased and destabilizing pressure. The results of the 1998 and 2012 island-wide referendums on the status question each suggests different ways in which this political discourse beside itself foregrounds the apparent intractability of U.S. colonialism and indexes trajectories elsewhere. Thus, in December 1998, the majority of the Puerto Rican electorate selected none of the above over statehood, commonwealth, or independence. As Francis Negron-Montaner argues, the victory of none of the above, quote, implied that for a significant number of voters, the available options were overly focused on nation-state membership as the solution to Puerto Rican problems, and affirmed, quote, the desire to imagine other alternatives, including the possibility of ignoring the question altogether. The 2012 status question referendum enacted another electoral aporia. Divided into a two-part ballot, Puerto Rican voters were asked first whether they supported maintaining the island's current status as an unincorporated territory and commonwealth. 54% responded no to this question. The second part of the ballot asked voters, regardless of their selection on the first question, to choose between statehood, independence, or sovereign free associated state status. Critics have argued that by attaching sovereign to free associated state, this third option amalgamated political autonomy and free association so as to potentially misdirect or conflate those opposed to statehood. And as a result, the Popular Democratic Party called for a boycott of the second part of the ballot, and 26% of those who voted in the first part left the second part blank. In this liminal space between the rejection of the current status in the first part of the ballot, which was also then a rejection of the sort of status quo or norms institutionalized and represented by the Popular Democratic Party itself, and the refusal to comply with the question as posed in the second half of the ballot, emerges the disjunction of the colonial find itself, only further accentuated by the cynical machinations of partisan political competition. Inasmuch as the status question is about colonialism, it is also therefore about discrepant Puerto Rican genealogies of belonging and dispossession, relations of identification and disidentification, and disqualified and desired futurities. Debates over the island's political status and conflicts involving anti-black racism and claims to indigeneity exist in tension with U.S. colonial rule through the status question. Race, argues Isar Gadro, quote, is a key idiom through which the institutions and peoples construct and interpret and defend Puerto Rican identity in the context of U.S. intervention. Moreover, Gadro contends, quote, the selective manner in which blackness gets constructed as part of the process, is informed by the different formulations of Puerto Rican nationhood developed in the context of U.S. colonial relationship.
I would add to Gaudreau's analysis of blackness the selective inclusion of indigeneity in the same sense as well, which is often imagined as either a kind of folkloric past that persists only in as much as it has been thoroughly incorporated and subsumed in the contemporary Puerto Rican nation, or as a living, authentic inheritance, but also fugitive identity from which a heroic anti-colonial survival can be reclaimed. So compelled by, in part, the emergence of a global indigenous peoples movement during the 1970s and 1980s, and paralleling the decline of the Popular Democratic Party hegemony in Puerto Rico, and ultimately, some folks argue, kind of propelled by the Colombian quincentennial in 1992, there's been an increasingly visible and vocal number of groups and organizations in Puerto Rico and the diaspora that have made their indigenous Taino identity, ancestry, their kind of primary form of identity. For some who identify in this way, what in fact makes them Puerto Rican or Boricua is this ancestry and the cultural traditions and practices they believe have been passed down, sometimes clandestinely, through their families. So as writer Tina Casanova insists, quote, "The primary element, the strongest root of Boricua is indigenous identity. Despite debated theory of extinction, the indigenous sense comes to our rescue to reaffirm the spiritual essence of our nationality, to retain our unique identity," end quote. Tony Castana argues that, quote, "indigenous cultural identity and the fight for independence have gone hand in hand in Borican and cannot be separated." So according to one of Castana's interlocutors, there's limited electoral support
for the Puerto Rican Independence Party because the party is in fact Eurocentric and has neglected the indigenous aspects of the movement. Yet, quote, "when the Boricua or Ibaro people speak, what they say has a deeper meaning beyond the words they use. When we say Indio, immediately people think fight for resistance or independence, or a lifestyle of self-sufficiency, not about foreign things," end quote. I would suggest that this immediacy is precisely indigeneity is deployed as a desire for certainty of belonging and under conditions in which colonialism appears to have made this impossible. Contemporary assertions of Taino identity vary considerably. For instance, some groups actually sought federal recognition as American Indian tribal nations and international rights as indigenous peoples. Despite the ways in which Puerto Rico, in certain ways, more closely resembles the Caribbean or Latin American context, despite this, the model of American Indian sovereignty is likely taken up both because of the island's specific relationship to the U.S. and also because of the kind of certainty that that legal form seems to convey. But I think what's important then to also keep in mind is that these conventions, as Joanne Barker so compellingly argues in her book Native Acts, are of course their own form of colonial bind. The very forms of acknowledgement and recognition are as well bound up with that. Writer and poet Aurora Levins Morales speaks to the complex tensions evident in other claims to a Taino identity by insisting that, quote, "This current wave of interest in reclaiming indigeneity is not exempt from the usual cultural appropriations of non-native peoples or simplistic idealizations of indigenous societies. But there's a growing collective effort on the part of those of us whose knowledge of our native heritage was taken from us, those for whom attempted genocide and our own people's survival strategies have robbed of genealogical certainty, to craft a contemporary mestiza identity that honors our deepest American roots." Yet here as well, the notion of a generalized deepest American roots of indigeneity would appear to efface as much as acknowledge the historically fraught local, regional, and imperial dynamics of power, racialization, and incommensurability, in which such claims are made under ongoing conditions of colonial dispossession. So in conclusion, I want to suggest that what this colonial bind disallows, what it renders unthinkable in this context, is a relation to kind of mixed descent that might potentially disrupt or trouble compensatory tropes of racial harmony or post-raciality. The colonial bind in this sense relies on what Lowe describes as the ways in which, quote, social differences become elaborated as normative categories for governance under the rubrics of liberty and sovereignty, end quote. We might further consider, therefore, how the conditions of unrepresentability, of uninhabitability, might be thought of in terms of Jody Bird's suggestion that understanding colonialism in the Americas, quote, as a cacophony of contradictorily hegemonic and horizontal struggles offers an alternative way of formulating and addressing the dynamics that continue to affect people as they move and are made to move within empire, that might ultimately undermine the competitions upon which colonialism relies. So dwelling and acting through this mode of unreconciled relation is, I believe, one manner of engaging Lowe's really generative conception of a past conditional temporality, as she puts it, a way to imagine a much more complicated set of stories about the emergence of the now, in which what is foreclosed as unknowable is forever saturating the what can be known.
Thank you. I'm incredibly and inexpressibly grateful to my friends and colleagues who've elicited from my book these wonderful ideas. I mean, as Gayatri said, I couldn't have written this book without the learning and the work of these three scholars. And nothing is more touching than to be read so attentively by three historians as well. So I'm just, thank you very much, and thank you to Gayatri for organizing this. My book quite deliberately doesn't center the United States because the founding of the United States marks neither the beginning nor the end of these intimacies of four continents. It had been, after all, the search for faster sea routes to Asia that had led the Spanish to the so-called discovery of the Americas in 1492, and the enduring desire for Asian luxury goods had a powerful influence on the culture, society, and economy of the Americas for the next 3 centuries. Before the 18th century British expansion of the transatlantic slave trade, the Portuguese had traded in African slaves in the 15th century, and the Spanish, Dutch, and French entered the trade in the 16th and 17th centuries. The Spanish ships that brought slaves from Africa to Mexico left Acapulco to cross the Pacific to Manila to trade American silver for Japanese lacquer boxes, Chinese silks, porcelains, and chinos esclavos, or Chinese slaves. In the 17th century, a Mexican painter depicted St. Francis regarding a map held encircled by figures representing Africa, Asia, America, and Europe. Much later, in Cuban Counterpoint, Fernando Ortiz described, quote, peoples from all quarters of the globe, quote, unquote, who labored in the New World to produce tobacco and sugar for European consumption. And he commented, quote, that sugar was mulatto from the start. C.L.R. James asserted in The Black Jacobins that the 18th century slave society in San Domingo gave rise to the French bourgeoisie, producing the conditions for the rights of man demanded in the Revolution of 1789. In other words, these global connections aren't new, and its longue array includes, but is not limited to, the brutal conquest of the Americas, the Spanish, Dutch, French, and British mercantile colonialism in the West Indies and East Indies, the transatlantic slave trade and import of Asian labor to the Americas, and the rise of liberalism, free trade, and empire. In my book, I'm trying to consider a particular moment of this longue array when there's a shift from mercantile colonialism and plantation slavery to liberal free trade and overseas empire. And as my colleagues have suggested, one of the things I argue is that we know relatively little about these histories because the racial class and state interests that formed colonial archives and national histories have profoundly shaped but also restricted the kinds of knowledge that we have about these global connections. So in the book, I try to consider the difficulties of understanding this past and ongoing social life of empire, when history often restricts itself to the stories of single peoples bounded within unified nations, disconnecting the links, incommensurable ones, as Alyosha Goldstein has pointed out, across continents involved in settlement, slavery, war, and colonial trades. So in reading across canons, archives, and continents, I found it necessary to break with customary modes for interpreting the past and to try to devise other ways of reading beyond and between the given accounts of national culture and society. In this way, the histories of England or the United States are not bounded or autonomous, but their emergence is complex, braided, and interconnected with colonial settlement and indigenous dispossession, slavery, and the East Indies and China trades in goods and people. The rise of the modern liberal nation involves, as colleagues have summarized more concisely than me, both the universal extension of liberal promises of rights, emancipation, wage labor, and free trade, but also the stark global divisions and colonial asymmetries upon which that liberal tradition depends, and according to which such liberties are reserved for some and wholly denied to others. And put differently then, the 18th and 19th century liberal thought defined the human and universalized its attributes to Anglo-American man, while simultaneously differentiating indigenous and enslaved peoples in the colonies as less than human. In my brief remarks today, I want to make explicit what's only implied in the book by situating the Massachusetts Bay Colony in New England within these processes that included settler colonialism, slavery, and overseas empire. In 1630, when the English arrived and settled in what would become Boston, the Wampanoag, Pequot, Nipmuc, and Massachusetts peoples had been living in the area for centuries. In John Winthrop's journal of early years of the settler colony and the war against the Pequot Indians who had struck back against the encroaching settlers, he makes references to African slavery. Winthrop's account notes that those native people who were not slaughtered in the Pequot massacre were traded in the West Indies for African slaves. And he records that the ship Desire, named Desire, returned to the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1638 with, quote, a cargo of cotton and tobacco and Negroes, unquote. The sale of prisoners, quote, from hostile nations became policy in Boston, a practice that brought hundreds of enslaved black peoples into the colonies. After the Royal African Company lost its monopoly on the slave trade in 1696, the New England colonists entered the transatlantic trade aggressively. And the Massachusetts Bay Colony was the first slaveholding colony whose laws stated that, quote, slavery was legal for lawful captives taken in just wars and such strangers as willingly sell themselves or are sold to us, unquote. After American independence, most of the laws sanctioned gradual emancipation, which Stephanie Smallwood has elaborated over decades, and slavery survived in many parts of the North until well into the 1860s. Yet these conditions are obscured by the more common historical narrative of a free white New England without settler colonialism or slavery, which was central to the antebellum American nationalism that constructed the North as liberal, abolitionist, and antithetical to the slaveholding South. This Northern triumphalism forgets both the history and persistence of both settler colonialism and local enslavement. Yet to the contrary, Salem and Boston's successes as centers of international trade that began in the 17th century entirely depended upon the dispossession of Native Americans and African slaves. In the last several decades, scholars and cultural institutions have worked to bring this hidden northern slavery into view. For example, when the African burial ground with skeletal remains of nearly 500 people was discovered in 1991 in downtown Manhattan, the New York Historical Society sponsored the Slavery in New York exhibit about the forgotten period of slavery that lasted from colonial times to 1827. Some local Boston historians have sought to make evident Boston's implication in the slave trade and how its shipbuilding, rum, distilling, and other industries were fueled by the commerce of slaveholding families. Craig Stephen Wilder has documented the extent to which the founding, financing, and development of higher education in New England was thoroughly intertwined with both the slave trade and the displacement and dispossession of indigenous peoples. Wilder writes, quote, "Colleges were imperial instruments akin to armories and forts. A part of the colonial garrison was specific responsibilities to train ministers and missionaries, convert indigenous peoples, and soften cultural resistance, and to extend European rule over foreign nations," unquote. Outside Boston, the Royal House and Slave Quarters Museum preserves the prominent estate of the Isaac Royal family, whose wealth was acquired through slave trading and the sugar, rum, and molasses trade. The royal family brought with them from Antigua enslaved Africans who worked the estate's orchards and farms. The wallpapers in the royal estate were painted with oriental patterns, alluding to the Chinese export wares traded in the large volume between Boston and China after the British East India Company monopoly ended. In this sense, the museum is a historical and ongoing cultural institution that both represents and obscures Massachusetts' links to Europe, Africa, and Asia. Early museums, such as the East India Marine Society, founded in Salem in 1799, preserved goods and specimens collected by prominent members of the early settler mariner colony, while those established later, such as the Peabody Essex Museum and the Museum of Fine Arts in the late 19th century, marked the place of Boston within imperial global connections and interdependencies. Museums, like colonial archives, are not static repositories or records. Rather, they are what we might call context zones, what Mary Louise Pratt and Jim Clifford have called context zones, or spaces of colonial encounter, coercion, and conflict. The structure of the museum collection makes and remakes a historical and political relationship between the collector and the collected, the viewer and the viewed, and the museum functions like a frontier in which objects are taken out of time and history, placed in glass cases, and staged within a tableau for the production of meaning. In this sense, museums are a material pedagogy, positioning the viewer and the viewed in a relationship of asymmetrical power, defining the past and present, the living and the dead, and establishing the settler community, in historian Jeannie O'Brien's terms, as, quote, first and last, apparently both preceding native peoples and surviving their demise. The East India Maritime Society, founded in 1799 in Salem, Massachusetts, is the forerunner of the Peabody Essex Museum that stands today. With the longest history of continuous operation of any public museum in the United States, the East India Maritime Society's membership was originally shipmasters and mariners who traveled around both the Cape of Good Hope and Cape Horn. The Society's first printed catalog of 1821 describes the collection as, quote, a cabinet of natural and artificial curiosities, and a motto of the Society that often served as a toast at society dinners was, quote, a cabinet that every mariner may possess the history of the world, unquote. The curiosities collected by the settler mariners included archaeological objects, natural specimens, and art objects, conflating native peoples and cultures with natural minerals and plants, and blurring the provenance of objects from India, China, Tahiti, Hawaii, or Turkey. The catalog of articles reveals a bewildering variety of objects, from weapons and shoes to clothing and ornamental jewelry, tools, and so forth, as well as rocks and shells and bird feathers and so forth. The museum collection, like the institution of the World's Fair, is a powerful medium for producing knowledge about objects and other peoples and cultures, arranging them within an imperial system of meaning. Like the British East India Company, the Salem East India Maritime Society was part of an early phase of globalization, as mercantilism shifted away from the monopolies of companies to liberal free trade, and turned from long-term contracted agreements to lucrative new markets, new trade routes, and from colonialism to liberal governance, from slavery to abolition. The motto of the East India Maritime Society, first in the United States for descendants in some distant day, also names its mission of collection as constituting a nationalist patrimony, an inheritance to be passed on from American settler mariner fathers to citizen sons. In the late 19th century, the East Indian Marine Society combined with the Peabody Academy of Science, and then in the late 20th century it joined the Essex Institute to become the Peabody Essex Museum, bringing together the various collections associated with marine voyages, natural history, and ethnology. In museum historian Walter Whitehill's words, the Peabody Essex, quote, thus still fulfilled both the purpose of the East India Marine Society to collect natural and artificial curiosities and the object of George Peabody's trust to promote science and useful knowledge, unquote. Today, the Peabody Essex holds Native American art, China export trades, and Australasian and Pacific Islander souvenirs, staged to give visitors a sense of the earlier social zeitgeist, to replicate what the earlier museum may have looked like. Wood-carved figureheads from the ship's prows adorn the walls, a Native American man, a female colonist. The walls are lined with cabinets, and one shelf assembles together items of quite disparate and distant origins, an Incan figure, a Tahitian mask, Lakotan pipe bowl, a Calcutta likeness of Jagannath, an early American voting box. Furthermore, in the 19th century, the Peabody Essex Museum intently acquired Asian decorative arts, and it now possesses the largest collection of Chinese export goods in the United States, figuring the ascendancy of the fledgling nation over England on the international stage. Now, I want to mention in closing a collection called Made in the Americas, currently on exhibit until, I think, February 1st at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. This exhibit links Boston's historical importance in the China trade with earlier Mexican and Latin American trades with India, Japan, Korea, and China. It showcases porcelains, silver, lacquerware, textiles, and tapestries that were imported by Spain and Portugal to the Americas in the 17th and 18th centuries, as well as objects made locally in Mexico, Central and Latin America, in an imitative style called achinado, or what in Europe and North America would be called chinoiserie. The collection showcases the influences of Chinese and Japanese arts upon Catholic Latin America, such as in a painting of Christ with Chinese porcelain vases at his feet, and upon decorative art and furniture production, such as in this desk and bookcase from Mexico. As you can see, the outside of the desk is decorated in a Moorish Islamic pattern of wood and inlaid shell brought by Spanish explorers, while the inside, painted in a red chinoiserie style, represents a 16th century indigenous map of a Veracruz plantation depicting African slaves at work. So the piece suggestively brings together Asian artisanal techniques, Islamic design, indigenous Mexican map-making traditions, and African labor. The exhibit's mixture of both imported Asian and Latin American-made objects remaps this question of so-called influence and reconfigures centers and peripheries, while it emphasizes Spanish trans-Pacific routes rather than exclusively Anglo-American transatlantic blends. Mexican-made ceramics echo China-made porcelains. At the same time, alongside Latin American biombos, styled after Asian folding screens and encromado furniture lacquered and inlaid with shell, there are prominent examples of Boston-made chinoiserie, as in this lacquered furniture from Boston made, and this embroidered bed curtain, also made in Boston. Notably, there's a 1769 painting by John Copley of the Boston merchant Nicholas Boylston, dressed in a long, loose Oriental silk robe, or banyan. In other words, although Boston's contemporary relationship to Asia and Latin America is rather different than it was in the days of the East India Marine Society, the Museum of Fine Arts continues to be concerned to locate Boston at the center of a cosmopolitan world of exchanges and trade. While early museums like the, in conclusion, while early museums like the East India Marine Society and the contemporary ones like the Peabody Essex or MFA have sought to represent New England in relation to Native American or African American communities and to Asian export trades, the sociology of museums and the practices of museum collection continue to reproduce the asymmetry of power between the settler mariner collectors on the one hand and the people rendered as objects collected on the other. Museums tend to omit the violent processes of settlement, slavery, and colonialism, like colonial archives themselves, in order to sustain what we might think of as a New England exceptionalism that positions Massachusetts as liberal, abolitionist, and anti-imperial, and thus fundamentally different than either the British or Spanish empires or the slaveholding U.S. South. the obscured connections between liberal ideas of abolition, wage labor, liberal government, and free trade on the one hand, and settler colonialism, slavery, and East Indies and China trades on the other, was certainly as central to the history of New England and the United States as it was to the rise of the British Empire. Thanks.